Hi Steve, thanks a million for coming to visit us and to answer our questions. So first thing, could you introduce yourself briefly so that people who may not know you can get the necessary information?
Thank you for inviting me. My name's Steve Bell. I'm a cartoonist, a political cartoonist. I work mainly for The Guardian in the newspaper, a daily newspaper in England. And it's a very interesting job.
Okay, so we can go. That's a question from Jonathan, who studies sound.
Right.
Hi. You're famous for drawing cartoons for The Guardian, but this year you're one of the 3 jury members for the This Is England Film Festival. Has your occupation given you different perspective during conversations with the other jury members?
It's a good question. I've always loved film. I even studied film when I was, many years ago when I was a student. I studied art, then I specialised in film. So I've always loved film and I even made films then, back when I was a student. Right. So I have a special interest. I like watching lots of TV. So that adds to my perspective. My perspective, I suppose, is as any viewer would be. I watched all the films, the entries, and kind of just tried to enjoy them as best I could. Some I liked, some I didn't like. Most of the standard was very high. It was very good stuff.
I guess so. Yes. So that leads us to the second question, I guess. So that's a question from Pierre, who also studies sound, mind you.
Hi. Does this week experience as a member of the jury correspond to what you were expecting? And what is it like to be a member of the jury?
Right. I wasn't sure what to expect. I've never really been on a jury to judge, certainly not to judge films. And so far it's been great. We met last night to discuss all the entries and came to a conclusion. It was very amicable. The experience was, I think, a good one. It was very interesting, and we had to discuss put our different points of view, try to argue the points we felt about the different entries. I think we did pretty well, actually. I think it was a good session, and I hope we've come.
You've reached a conclusion, which is really what matters. Okay, right. Now, probably the next question, which is more about what you usually do in The Guardian. A question from Grégoire, who studied editing.
The Rouen exhibition shows that many of your cartoons are based on well-known paintings. Can you describe the creative process which leads to such provocative caricatures?
Well, the use of references, which I do all the time, it's often works of art, famous paintings. Mm-hmm. It can be photographs, it can be films. I refer to films, and the work is full of, because when you do work day by day, you're looking for links, for things that you can use to make your point. Firstly comes, I have an idea about what I want to say about what is happening in the world, in politics. I have my own viewpoint, which I want to express. But to express it, I need something which will have contact with people who are looking at it. So you very often resort to famous pictures, which I hope most people will know. Not everybody, but most people will have it somewhere in the back of their minds. The great thing about these pictures is I can use them as a vehicle for my own point. I'm sort of hitching a ride on a great image. It's good for me because it saves me effort, but also it enables me to study the originals and to draw them again. And it's always interesting. You always learn something more when you look at these great
somehow
things.
It allows you to develop a technique using other people's techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not doing a pastiche. I'm borrowing the structure of their image and using it for my own purposes. So that's what I do.
Sure. Well, that actually echoes somehow the question that Luis wanted to ask. He studies cinematography.
How did you react to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and has this dramatic event had any consequences on the way you conceive of your work?
Terrible day back in January 2015. when you, I think it was just coming back after the Christmas holidays, suddenly this awful thing happened. And, well, because I'm working day by day, I have to do something to respond. Because it's cartoonists, I feel it touches me personally. Also, it's because one of the guys, Tinius, was a cartoonist I met. I knew him. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy. So I felt first time really, I suppose, I've had a sort of personal connection with a terrible event like that. So it was a terrible moment when you discovered this had happened. It was just a shock. And then to add to my problems, I had phone calls all day, was radio, TV, papers, ringing up, you're a cartoonist, what do you think? Yeah. Well, but also I had to do a comment. I had to do that day's cartoon and try and focus my efforts on
the Mickey Mouse
cartoon.
Yeah,
so I did this image of these idiots with Mickey Mouse ears and sort of skeleton, scary suits on, because that's what they're trying to do, to frighten everybody, which is what I suppose.
But I mean, I guess that Lewis's question is more about if it had changed anything about the way you conceive of, the function of what you do, and do you think you have more of a duty towards the breeders, or hasn't changed anything?
It hasn't really, because this has been in the air for a long time before. Mm-hmm. So you have, I suppose, since the days of Salman Rushdie, when that first came, that was back in the 80s.
Yeah, but in any case, luckily, it didn't change.
It didn't really change. It gave you pause for thought, but it didn't change anything.
All right, good. Now for another question from Stephen, sound engineer as well.
Hello. You have studied cinema at university before becoming a cartoonist. Have you ever considered getting involved in cinema in one way or another?
Well, yeah, obviously. When I studied film, it was part of a fine art course, but I specialised in film. I love doing film. The course involved making films, 16mm short films. And I really loved the process of editing, of shooting, of... what I wasn't so good at was on organisation, and working with other people, which are what I have learnt about myself, I suppose, is that I'm very good at working on my own. I'm not so good at working in a kind of team. Yeah. Cartooning is a very solitary occupation, and I like it that way, I suppose. That's the way I prefer it. And it suits my temperament, if you like. I'm quite happy to get on with the job. The other thing about, I suppose, strip cartoons is actually you're doing all the work of a film anyway. You're just doing it in a series of pictures.
So are you not considering coming up with a cartoon, or?
Well, it's the same process. It saves the bother of finding extras, building a set. You just draw it. It's a wonderful. So there's an element of the cinematic in comics anyway.
Yeah, which leads us straight to the next question from Anaïs, studies production.
Hi, does cinema have a strong influence on your artistic vision?
Absolutely, yes, it does. I mentioned cinema influences all of us, all our outlooks, because I'm one of the first TV generation. My family, I was 3 years old when my family first got a television, which was in 1954, 60 years ago, or 63 years ago now. And I've been goggling ever since. On TV, you've always had old films coming through, and some of them are terribly, they really grab you by the eyeballs and just take you over. I remember seeing things like Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. I was a kid, I didn't know what the hell it was about, but it was so striking, so impressive. I've used that in many cartoon references to his death playing chess on the beach. So yeah, cinema is hugely inspired. When I did my film course, I specialised in films of the Popular Front in France, and with reference to the work of Jean Renoir. That was what I was specialising in, which was a fascinating period, and I love the films. There's a kind of wildness about it that I love, about French films, about French language, I suppose, as well. I always loved French.
Okay, anyways, last question from the students, from Maxime, and I'll let you appreciate it. It's a tricky question.
Generally speaking, which are the 3 movies which have most impressed you so far in your life?
Tricky question.
3 movies.
Yeah, you could say
Right.
more if you want.
I suppose I mentioned one which was The Seventh Seal. I would say I mentioned Renoir, and of his, I think my favourite was Règle du Jeu. Règle du Jeu. A beautiful little film that was made during the war, and I used it actually. I plundered it. I'm a great one at plundering existing works. And when I was doing my film course, and I had to make a little film. I made a little war film. It was a sort of, it wasn't a book about the Second World War. It was in the 1970s. I was doing this. So it was imagining a situation where there was an urban war going on, which there was going on in Northern Ireland, which looks very like Leeds, where I was a student. So I made this film about a kind of urban. There was very little action in it. It was about the behind the scenes, and it was called Live Like Pigs, Die Like Dogs. And I used the soundtrack of this wonderful film called Listen to Britain, which was made by a director called Humphrey Jennings during the World War II. It was kind of propaganda, but it was also very. All it was a montage of sounds, everyday sounds that summed up the country. So you had classical music being played in the National Gallery, you had the sound of a Spitfire engine, you had the sound of a train chuffing slowly. The way the sounds were mixed together was absolutely hypnotic. Look out for this film. This is a wonderful film. Humphrey Jennings, Listen to Britain. It's very short. It's only about 20 minutes long.
Okay.
And I plundered the soundtrack and used that as my soundtrack for my film. Right. That's what I would say that film had a huge influence. And it's in the, I suppose, the British documentary tradition, which is just like every other documentary tradition, but it's a very specific way that it uses images and sound especially. Because sound is everything in films. That's another thing I love about doing animation, that soundtrack in some ways comes first. The visuals are almost like following along. Yeah. Right. Not secondary, but yeah.
Okay, well,
equally
now for one last question from me, I'm very curious to know which word you would use to describe your experience for this week in the This Is English.
Which word?
Word. Oh, word.
A work.
Which word?
A word. Which word? Right. Well, so far, tiring.
All right.
Like yesterday was a long day. I think I'm back to normal now. I think I recharged my batteries. Yesterday was a very long day. It was a good day. It was interesting, but and doing the judging in the evening, it was hard work. It was worth it. It was very, very exciting too. So exciting and tiring.
All right. Okay. Well, I guess that would be the final word. Thanks a million for being with us. And for the students and for the festival as well.
Well, thank you, Guillaume. Thanks.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye now.
Thank you.